Welcome to the Will to Power podcast. I am your host, Bronze Age Midget. Before we begin, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a little comment. Helps me know that you enjoy this, and also helps me in the algorithm so that more people can be exposed to the righteous, burning truth. Let's begin. So today, I wanted to talk about the implicit a priori assumptions of Marxism, how they fly in the face of reality and what happens when that occurs. So if you've ever read the Communist Manifesto, it's an interesting book, probably in the 1800s. That was my first impression of it. I actually read the Communist Manifesto, I think in 7th grade, and I finished it, and my initial reaction was, wow, I bet that was really compelling and inspirational in 1848, whenever it was written. But years later, after kind of thinking about what is contained within the Communist Manifesto, Marx's most famous book, I think it is apparent that there's a ton of assumptions that have been not critically examined, right? There's all these assumptions made in Marxism that are just kind of taken as a given when they don't line up with reality. And we're going to see what those are right now. So the first one is all hetero history is the history of class struggle. So in Marx's conception of history, society is shaped by struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. Now this is a very bleak point of view, but it's also wrong. If anything, it's exactly wrong, right? It's the opposite of the truth. Real history is the history of class collaboration. It's the development of distinct hierarchies and functional classes that work together to create a larger society, to create something bigger than the sum of the individual units. And that's what we've seen throughout history. Any society worth speaking about today, whether it's the Romans or the Chinese emperors, the dynasties and everything, those had a very complex division of labor, division of social status, and that's what made them unique. That's what made them successful. That's what helped them build a complex society. So what's the opposite of that, though? What is the opposite of a society without class struggle, without classes? It would be something like a hunter-gatherer society. And Marx even noted this. He called it primitive communism. But he's entirely wrong in thinking that history is really just class struggle. In reality, it's class collaboration. It's different groups working together to achieve societal aims. During the 1800s, that was colonialism. Even during the time, right, Marx could have witnessed that he was wrong in seeing how these societies were working together to go pillage other societies. And again, Marx would be like, well, this is just another example of class struggle, these classes collaborating together to struggle against others. But, struggle itself is an important aspect of history, right? We all take up space. We're moving through space, eliminating other objects from that space. There's a certain amount of struggle there. Like evolution, natural selection, sexual selection, these all involve competition. So struggle and competition is a very fundamental element of the universe, and I've talked about that before. But when it comes to human society, what makes us unique is the ability to collaborate on a large scale, to form complex societies that achieve great things. Now, you can't really explain something like going to the moon or all of these developing microprocessors and cybernetics and these sorts of things through simply class struggle. It takes a wide array of efforts to make that happen, and that can only happen through collaboration. So again, Marx, he talks about how struggle is the motive force of history, but then his end goal is also communism, a stateless, classless society. But what would that even mean according to that logic? Would that be an end of history? Would, kind of human society quit evolving? That's a very good question, which isn't answered by Marx, really. But in reality, Marxists have an extremely instrumentalist point of view when it comes to history. They see history, while they use this fancy trope about history being class struggle, merely class struggle, in reality, they see history as a narrative. They see it as a kind of contested narrative which you can use to impose your worldview today. So that is to say that Marxists are usually devout liars who believe what they say. What they say is often shallow and moralistic. It's a very shallow view of history, in which they're always siding with the oppressed. It's essentially like this, root for the little guy sort of ideology. But that becomes contorted, right? Even Marx himself didn't do this. He saw colonialism as a good thing, as lifting the rest of the world out of feudalism, out of kind of primitive class relations into capitalism. But of course, today's Marxists repudiate that view, and they see the societies uprooted by colonialism as somehow morally superior. They somehow think that the pyramids where people were sacrificed by the Aztecs were better than the Spanish Empire, where the pyramids themselves were better than the colonial palaces built by the Spanish, which I can tell you they're not. The colonial palaces look a lot better. They're not just rocks stacked on top of each other in the form of a pyramid. So that's the initial thing that Marx gets wrong, right? History is not simply class struggle. It's often class collaboration, people working together, having different functional relationships with one another in order to achieve great things together. Now, the second aspect, the second a priori assumption made by Marx is that his goal, so to speak, is all power to the proletariat, all power to the working class, or power to the masses, and in today's terms they talk about power to the oppressed. But what is this in reality? In reality, they're putting their faith in incompetent people who must rely on the strength of numbers to do anything. These aren't people who derive power from intelligence or cunning or wit or even strength. These are people who derive power merely because they're a part of a large group. Now, this is a kind of wretched philosophy. Like, we all know on an intuitive level that people are pretty dumb. The masses are retarded. Even Marxists on an intuitive interpersonal level believe this, right? It's not like Marxists are happy people who enjoy the presence of society, right? They generally have a very dim view of, quote unquote, the masses. Yet somehow, when thinking in abstract terms, they love the masses and they want to give all power to the masses. What a terrible idea this could be. How could that ever go wrong? And I'll tell you exactly how it goes wrong. We can see how this works out in reality. Like, even on a theoretical level, just look how your average leftoid collective house is ran. The anarchist soup kitchen sort of society. Imagine that on a widespread level. Everybody's dirty. You're eating shitty old moldy food. And this is a good example to some extent of what happens in socialist societies, but we need to go even further because we need to look at the reality of how power develops, right? You can't will power away. Power will always congeal. And insofar as you're putting your faith in this kind of incompetent grouping known as the masses, well, that obviously won't work. That won't achieve anything. So within Marxism, you have the development of the notion of the vanguard, right? The leading edge of the revolution, which of course is never made up of the working class, but usually intellectuals, kind of disgruntled academics, things of that nature. So you end up with a Leninist party, ran by intellectuals who conceive of themselves as the vanguard, not simply of the masses, but of history itself. And once they seize power, if they manage to do that, they simply arrange themselves as a new bourgeoisie, which is actually the new class. It's a great book by, I can't remember his name right now, but I'll put it up on the screen in an edit. But it talks about how, the Leninist vanguard in the Soviet Union established itself as a ruling class within that society. So again, incompetent people who can't actually do things have to be represented by a quote-unquote vanguard, a demagogic vanguard, which establishes itself as a new ruling power Now, the next implicit assumption of Marxism is that socialism equals the abolition of private property. So they want to socialize the means of production. And this sounds fancy and great on paper. It's like, well, we're just giving the ownership of the means of production to the people who work with it. But how does that even work? That's a fancy notion that sounds great hypothetically. And lots of Marxism does. Marxism is essentially like, if you tick off 5 to 10 concurrent hypothetical scenarios that work out in your favor, yeah, I guess Marxism works. But if any one of those hypothetical things doesn't work out, it throws off your whole plan. And that's essentially the problem with planning and rationalizing a society. It requires a lot of things going your way. So what happens when you abolish private property and you socialize the means of production? Does the working class actually own the means of production? Do they actually control the means of production? And the answer is a resounding no. In reality, that never happens. Who ends up controlling the means of production? It's bureaucrats. It's unelected, nepotistic bureaucrats that have established themselves in power and who are much harder to challenge whenever the reigning ideology is that, no, we're all equal. So that brings us to the fourth a priori assumption under Marxism that flies in the face of reality. That is the valorization of equality above all else. Now, Marxists in their naive, malformed frontal cortexes believe that equality is the end-all, be-all virtue. If it's unequal, then it's bad. Now, this, of course, sounds appealing to the low-value people and the naive, the young. A world without winners and losers sounds great for losers. But in reality, equality is a public vice. It's very maladaptive. What does that equal society look like? Well, it looks like the society that gets conquered by the unequal society. It's the Bantu longhouse, and it's not even. And it's even if we have these rose-colored conceptions of what pre-capitalist society looks like, the Bantu longhouse collective village, there's still power within that. Usually it's old people, right? It's grandma runs the household, or grandpa pretending he's a shaman, right? And everybody has to play along. It's kind of the emperor has no clothes sorts of thing, where everybody has to play along with the power of the elders within the village or the power of the women. But again, it's more equal than, say, Rome, but you're not going to survive against Rome if that's your society. So that's the other point, is that this a priori assumption that equality is good, the loser-slave morality, where the only thing that matters is equality, it's not even that fun or useful, right? It's a very narrow conception of virtue. It's like this one thing is virtue, it's just equality, and then everything else can be ignored. Things like greatness, excellence, strength, beauty, intelligence, courage, mastery, honor. All of these much more important things that are in fact much more easier to control, right? You can kind of develop yourself into an honorable character while still improving yourself. While on the other hand, if you're only focused on equality, well, what are you going to do? You're going to make sure not to rise too high. And if you do try to rise too high, people are going to pull you down if you live in a society where equality is the main virtue. And again, it's a somewhat impossible standard because power will always congeal. And so instead of a society where you have a clear means to rise through various different hierarchies and thus achieve some sort of a semblance of satisfaction with your life, of accomplishment. These are the things that make life worth living, is going through these struggles, fighting battles and winning. But Marxists want to do away with that. They want to create a society where everything is congealed into very apparent power dynamics which you cannot speak about. So everything becomes congealed into cliques and nepotism, and it becomes forbidden to talk about how power actually operates in these societies. And this is actually true. I mean, you see this in kind of the anarchist leftoid collective, where you get that sort of dynamic. There's definitely power relations going on, power differentials. And one of two things can happen. You can either not talk about it, or you talk about it and it destroys whatever you have going on. And that's the same thing that happens in a socialist, a quote-unquote socialist society, somewhere like Vietnam or China or the USSR, is you definitely have power happening, but nobody can talk about it, or they'll be arrested by the secret police for being a terrorist, or for going against national interest, some sort of euphemism like that. So again, equality is a pathetic virtue for the unimaginative and for the naive. But what is the alternative, right? If it's not equality, what are the virtues we base our society around? And I already spoke of those: beauty, strength, honor, courage, mastery, intelligence, skill, courage. That's a big one. So you build a society around a diverse set of adaptive virtues. And then the leftoid conception is, if you just have equality, then everything else will work out. People will be these fully adapted, self-actualized, great people. When that's not true. That's a speculative claim that has no evidence to back it up. If you just make if everybody's equal, it doesn't necessarily mean that society will be nice, that it will be a fun place to live, that it will be a great place to live, that it will be an adaptive society that can be resilient against the impositions of other societies. So the better alternative is just to skip the equality as the primary virtue and just work to those things that actually make society good. And I'm not saying we need extreme disparity, right? There's a golden mean there. You don't want a society where disparities are so extreme and apparent, causing disruption to your society and withering it away from the inside, causing internal dissidence, internal fracturing, and those sorts of things. But at the same time, you don't want the public vice of equality, extreme equality, where you're demanding everybody fit into a mold and you're pretending that actual power dynamics don't exist. So the fifth a priori assumption under Marxism that is completely wrong is that capitalism will spawn its own downfall. And capitalism is the final society marked by class relations. And capitalism will necessarily create the conditions of socialism. Now, this was an idea of Marx himself. This was later amended by, I believe, Rosa Luxemburg, who commented that we're either going towards socialism or barbarism. So capitalism will either spawn socialism, or it will be this devolution into kind of widespread violence and thuggery. Now, again, this is a very rosy sort of picture of the way society works. It's like, socialism will inevitably come, or socialism will inevitably come, or capitalism will just falter, will collapse. And again, this is very naive. This is very unimaginative, because the reality is that there is an alternative, and it's this neo-tributary states that I've talked about elsewhere. Whether the neo-tributary state is the USSR, or whether it's Western Globo Homo, or whether it's Sino-Cyborg society. So the neo-tributary state spawning out of capitalism is the real possibility. And again, I've talked about this elsewhere, but Marxoids seem completely incapable of conceiving of an alternative society which could be worse in terms of individual freedom, social mobility, the ability to express a range of human potential. And I think that's an interesting distinction between those on the right and those on the left, is that those on the left often view that they have this view that society could be so much better. If only we had more equality, or if only we did this, if only we put the people in power, society would be better. Whereas the right wing understands that no, society could be much worse. The way we've got it now is pretty nice, but in some respects it's a little bit of a house of cards as well, and it could all collapse. It could become much worse, or it could develop in a way that's much worse. Like I said, the neo-tributary state. So I'm going to end it there. those are the the five main a priori assumptions of Marxism that are simply false. You have history is the history of class struggle, wrong. It's the history of class collaboration primarily. You have that all power should go to the proletariat. In reality, that's a stupid idea. These people are incompetent. Anybody with a brain knows this. Even Marxists know this on an intuitive and interpersonal level. Again, that's just a wrong idea that's nested within a Marxism. You can't have a Marxism without believing some version of that, the valorization of the oppressed, the belief that the oppressed are saints, poverty is a virtue, these sorts of things. You have the notion of the abolition of private property, and the socializing the means of production. And they take this to mean that this is some sort of democratic reform, when in reality this is usually either a power grab by bureaucrats or it devolves into the rule by bureaucrats. Again, things aren't as rosy as Marxism thinks it is. If the world was as good as Marxists thought, well, fuck, sign me up. But, there's reality and then there's the map of the world that people have. Two very different things. The fourth a priori assumption of Marxism is that equality is the primary virtue. Again, equality is a public vice. Marxism is almost 100% wrong. He's literally on the opposite end of what is right. Again, the fifth one is that capitalism will collapse or will evolve into socialism. Now, again, will evolve into that rosy version of socialism, the democratic egalitarian society. Again, wrong. Marx 100% wrong, Marxists 100% wrong. And again, the opposite is the reality, is that a society marked by even more, or even, I guess not even more, but even more congealed class relations, more congealed hierarchy, one that's less, one that is almost impossible to navigate up. One where social mobility is far less of a thing, and one much more marked by compliance and allegiance. So again, Marx is just wrong on so many instances, but nobody challenges those things, right? They're kind of taken as a given, and that's normal whenever you read philosophy or history, you kind of suspend disbelief. But in this case, this is bordering on science fiction, social science fiction would be a good, that's really, we should create a genre of literature, social science fiction, and that's where a lot of Marxist and anarchist literature should go, because that's what it is. It's almost like a fairy tale, quite honestly. So I'm just going to end with a Marx quote, and it is, all political power is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. Now, regardless of whether that is true or not, let's sideline that discussion for a moment. Does that fly in the face of reality, yes or no? Let's forget about that. And let's just ask ourselves, needless to say, someone with such a dark view of political power should not be given political power, right? Somebody who believes that political power is just a means to oppress people, well, that's probably not the sort of person you want in charge of your society. That just makes simple sense. You want somebody with a slightly more positive, slightly more empowering view of political power than just, hey, this is a means for me to oppress people. So I'm going to end that. I'll probably do another podcast similar to this, but rather just responding directly to different Marx quotes, because again, so much of what he says is 100% wrong, and it deserves to be challenged point by point. So if you enjoyed this podcast, I'm going to tell you what to do next. So if you enjoyed that podcast, please do me a favor.